November 30, 1991, Guangzhou, China. 63,000 fans fill a stadium to watch the U.S. play Norway in the final of the first official Women's World Cup. As the U.S. prepares to take the field, the team gathers one last time. We don't know what was said in the huddle, but we know how it ended, with a chant. OOSA, 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 ah.
5 years later, in Atlanta, in the final of the first Women's Olympic Soccer Tournament, the U.S. huddles up before taking on China. Again, the chant, OOSA, 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 ah.
Same right before the 1999 World Cup final. Same for every U.S. women's national team game over the last 4 decades. The players and coaches change, but one thing has remained the same, the pre-game OOSA chant. It's a tradition that started in a small stadium in an Italian resort town in 1985, where the very first U.S. women's national team was playing its first international tournament. Today, on the 40th anniversary of the opening game, we're going to go to that Mundialito, the Little World Cup. We're also going to go back 140 years to track the line of women's soccer that led to that U.S. team, and then see how an unlikely week in Italy laid the foundation for one of the most dominant programs in American sports.
This is an American game.
Michelle Akers is a legend of U.S. soccer. A 4-time All-American at the University of Central Florida, Hermann Trophy winner, 2-time World Cup winner, Olympic gold medalist, and Hall of Fame inductee. When she speaks about women's soccer in the U.S., it's best to listen.
She once told Grant Wall that the U.S. Women's World Cup victory in 1999 was a tsunami hitting the shore, and by that she meant a wave had been set in motion by an earthquake earlier, somewhere else. Now, traditionally, the quake is thought to be the 1991 World Cup. That's where Anson Dorrance coached Akers, along with young stars like Mia Hamm, Julie Foudy, and Christine Lilly, to the first U.S. women's title. Akers scored both goals in a 2-1 win over Norway.
But Akers was also part of an even earlier U.S. women's national team. And if you're looking for the tremor that started that wave of success in the 90s and beyond, you've got to look at Jesolo, Italy in 1985, where the first U.S. women's national team wore hand-me-down men's kits and began its journey to show they belonged among the world's best. Now, that 1985 team was pulled together at the last minute when
Whoa. You think we can just start with the 1985ers? This is an American game. Let's talk about the 1893ers.
All right, Professor. Drop some dusty newspaper knowledge.
I will. On December 3rd, 1893 in San Francisco, California, the Colleen Bonds beat the Bonnie Lasses 2-0 in the earliest documented women's game on U.S. soil. The sides played again a week later and drew. The 2 games didn't lead to other teams forming or league play, but the point is this. There were other earthquakes in soccer that may not have created a tsunami, but they widened the fault lines for the U.S. women a bit.
Fair enough. Let's stay in the old sepia days that we love so much around here. The first Women's International took place between England and Scotland in Edinburgh in 1881. 5,000 onlookers watched, but the match had to be abandoned after hundreds of men invaded the pitch in the 51st minute. Players had to flee in horse-drawn carriages. The press described the idea of women playing football as, quote, grotesque and unfeminine, unquote.
Undeterred, the British Ladies Football Club formed in 1895, a time when football was considered a man's game. The club challenged notions of dress and play. These women wanted to wear blouses and bloomers and proper football boots. And they also wanted the right to vote. It was political football, you could say. But there was pushback, and by the early 1900s, the Football Association banned its members from playing ladies' teams. But girls and women played on.
So, women in the British Isles were playing the game, which meant that the English, Scottish, and Irish women who were immigrating to the U.S. knew that women could play.
Like those sweet Colleens and Bonnie Lasses in San Fran, as well as across the country in New Jersey. When I give a tour of Kearney, we start at Top's Diner. Not because it's the best diner in the country, but because the parking lot used to be Clark Thread Mills Field, the one we talked about in episode 2. The Clark Thread team, ONTFC for short, was the first dynasty in American soccer, winning the first 3 AFA Cups in 1885, 86, and 87. The firm employed more women than men, so I've always been hopeful I'd find evidence of girls and women playing. I've looked hard, but the records are scarce, and I haven't found any. From the diner, I can point into the distance at a massive cathedral, Sacred Heart Basilica. Before construction started in 1898, the open field was simply called Bishop's Lot. Grace Hawthorne played there with her brothers. A newspaper called her, quote, the girl wonder, and said she took kicks in the shins in soccer like any of the rest of the boys. She asked no concession and gave none either. Grace went on to be a YMCA employee and was sent to France during the First World War.
We've talked in earlier episodes about how World War I shut down soccer leagues in Europe, as well as most international games. Women picked up the slack, a league of their own style, and nearly 200 teams formed, including the most famous of them all, the Dick Kerr ladies from Preston, England. That's Dick, Kerr. We don't want to get Tom fired from Notre Dame. Dick Kerr was a munitions factory that allowed its female employees to start a team in 1917, and they drew big crowds to charity games that raised money for wounded soldiers.
Massive crowds, including one at Goodison Park in Liverpool in 1920. 53,000 people watched Dick Kerr top St. Helens ladies 4-0. Since I started teaching Britain in the global game at Notre Dame, without fail, a handful of students write end-of-semester research papers on women's football. The Dick Kerr ladies changed the game.
A bit too much for the men of the English FA, who banned women from playing on FA grounds the following year. The Dick Kerr team would last until 1965, the FA ban until 1971, throttling women's soccer development in England. But back in the 20s, finding their options limited at home, the Dick Kerr team set out on a tour of the United States and Canada in 1922.
I did a deep dive on that tour. Some lowlights. There was no women's teams to play, so they only played against men. They were banned from staging any matches on Canadian soil, and the tour fell victim to financial mismanagement. It was feared that they wouldn't have enough funds to return home.
Okay, Tom, you're bumming us out. How about some highlights?
Okay. A U.S. soccer official stepped in to fix the financial mess, and the Dick Kerr ladies got to face players like Pete Renzulli, one of our forgotten keepers from the 1920s. He said,
We were the national champions, and we had a hell of a time beating them. For the purpose of this podcast, Pete Renzulli sounds like Hatch from Victory.
Love it, love it. Get Hatch in there. The Preston side won some, lost some, and drew some during the 2-month tour. Everywhere people spoke of their high caliber of soccer.
I'm just interrupting the Dick Kerr thing for a sec. It has occurred to me we were able to get Stallone back in an episode. We haven't gotten Worsted in for a while.
Yeah.
Any chance? Yeah.
My good friend John Yurkowski keeps talking about this from the great state of Washington. He said, where's Worsted? He missed it. But I found a reference. In a column right next to a match report for the Dick Kerrs, there was a match report for Abbott Worsted Football Club, another textile team from Massachusetts. So there you go, John. Worsted for you.
Fan service. It's what we do. Back to the Dick Kerr tour, there was talk of another tour the following year when soccer towns like Fall River, Chicago, and Los Angeles would put out women's sides against the great English 11. That tour didn't happen, but the Dick Kerr Ladies Tour was similar to those Pilgrim FC tours in the early 1900s. It helped spread the gospel of women's soccer. Tom's friend, Dr. Brian Bunk, has written about early women's soccer. And what we want to emphasize, since it's the core of our show here, is, first of all, that early women's soccer in the United States was a thing. It was played at women's colleges, in ethnic clubs like the Maccabee Sport Club of Brooklyn and the Hungarian Athletic Club in Milwaukee, and in some trade unions like the International Ladies Garment Workers. A St. Louis pastor formed a 4-team league at his parish in 1951. So, in another example of U.S. soccer history being a mirror of the larger American story, women had been banging against the glass ceiling, or, going back to the tsunami metaphor, trying to create some seismic activity without much impact.
It's funny that you say glass ceiling. I just finished reading Declan Abernathy's dissertation. He also got a PhD in this stuff, so you don't have to. Titled Glass Ceiling, it documents the decades-long fight of the U.S. women's national team for equal access and pay. We're arguing that the expansion of the U.S. women's game started with small tremors of underwater activity. And then the real sea change came in the shape of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin.
Which was great, obviously, but I didn't hear anything about soccer.
Well, it has something to do with it. Basically, it led to what we know as Title IX, the 1972 law that prohibited sex-based discrimination in any education program or activity receiving federal funding. Schools and universities now had to provide equal access to all. So girls and women's school teams started popping up all over the country. Some youth soccer organizations followed suit. Others had to be forced to change.
In June of 1975, Pele came to the United States to play with the New York Cosmos of the NASL, inspiring a generation of boys and girls to play the game. That same year, in Northern California, a 9-year-old goalkeeper named Amy Love sued the State Youth Soccer Association. Title IX hadn't yet gone into effect, and she'd been barred from playing in a boys' league, but there was no girls' league. Amy won. And that December, she and Pele posed together on the cover of a new magazine, Soccer America. She had the royal approval of the King of Soccer.
We love that she's a goalkeeper, right?
Love it.
Yep. By the late 1970s, there are thousands of girls getting access to youth sport. It's a nationwide phenomenon. In 1976, 10,000 girls played high school soccer. In 2022, nearly 380,000 did. Colleges and universities started to form varsity teams in the mid-1970s, and by the early 80s, there were over 100 programs and an NCAA-sanctioned national championship. Today, nearly 30,000 women play collegiate soccer in the U.S., including Kirk's daughter at our alma mater. Legislation and attitudinal changes matter.
And frankly, so does money. In the 70s and 80s, even with no women's pro league to shoot for, playing soccer could still get you a scholarship. That 6-figure brass ring added to the girls' soccer boom.
And many of those pioneers started playing with boys. I like to say it was an accident of geography that I grew up in a soccer town. We had a rec league, travel soccer, and a high school team in the early 1970s. Gridiron football existed, but it wasn't the it sport in town. Gene Chisowitz, a Ukrainian refugee, coached the school team and helped run the club. He even coached the full national team for a few games in 1973. Well, by 1980, the high school had a girls' program which was fed by a handful of club teams.
That's Columbia High School, the alma mater of Hollywood actors Roy Scheider and Elizabeth Shue. Elizabeth was a really good player, as was her brother, Andrew. And if you watched our documentary Soccertown USA, you'll remember that when he was starring for Columbia, he lost a legendary state final to John Harkes and Carney.
And John never lets him forget about it. I believe it went to 22 penalty kicks, and Andrew might have missed 2.
Tom, you have told me about a girl in your grade who was a really standout player.
Pam Davis. I mean, she played on a rival boys team, and I had nightmares that she'd score on me. She was a high school All-American who played at UNC, winning a national title in 1987. Pam followed in Christian Bowser's footsteps, another All-American at both Columbia and UMass. So I grew up seeing these girls and young women playing at a high level. I'm a product of the suburban sporting scene, space really, that developed in the 70s and 80s. My mother saw some awful gridiron football injuries as a nurse, and she steered me away from football to soccer. At 9, I was already playing travel soccer. There were lots of clubs from wealthy white towns, but also working class places like Patterson, Newark, and our beloved Kearney. Some of those youth clubs grew out of the immigrant social clubs, like the Scots American Club.
And in Southern California, the ethnic clubs of the 1960s became Americanized by the newly formed American Youth Soccer Organization, the AYSO, as well as an explosion of youth clubs which tried to attract players by playing down their immigrant roots.
Clubs like the Granada Hills Black Widows, which Gwendolyn Rector played for. I spoke to Gwendolyn about her experiences growing up in the 70s and 80s. And she said it was hit or miss whether there was a club team in your town or a high school team. Some had school teams, but no club, and vice versa. They had to travel to play other girls' teams, quite the distances. So she routinely played against local boys' teams.
And we obviously can't profile every woman who played youth soccer in this era, but we do want to plug a book that helped shape this episode. It's called The Keeper by Dr. Kelsey Ervick. The subtitle is Soccer, Me, and the Law That Changed Women's Lives, And it's a really exceptional graphic memoir about the impact of Title IX, which also weaves in some of the stuff we're talking about today, like the Dick Kerr ladies, the suburban soccer boom, and college soccer. So, there's a growing population of girls playing soccer in the US in the 70s and 80s. And most of them are in the suburbs because if schools needed to offer equal athletic access to girls, sports that required fields were going to be easier to accommodate in the suburbs than the cities. I grew up in New York City. Our practice and game fields were needle and broken glass littered spots in Riverside and Central Park. There was only one boys club team that I was even aware of in Manhattan, the Kickers, and I didn't know of any girls who played soccer. And drilling down further, that suburban population of soccer girls was predominantly white. Again, the history of U.S. soccer is a mirror of the larger American story. So in the early 1970s, the suburbs were being flooded by white flight and segregated by redlining. The descendants of Irish, Scottish, English, Italian, German, and Scandinavian immigrants were now moving out of the cities and bringing an affection for the game that maybe their parents or grandparents played. And now suddenly, there are teams at their daughters' schools, youth leagues to play in.
Okay, so now we've got a dominant demographic of girls playing soccer in the U.S., but there's no official U.S. women's national team. There were paper teams in 1982, 83, and 84. U.S. Soccer had a list of its top players, but they didn't get together or compete. And now finally we get to 1985. The June 6th edition of Soccer America reported the following on page 4. Opposite news that the U.S. men's national team had failed to qualify for the 1986 World Cup. Quote, "Women's soccer will take a giant leap forward this summer," end quote. 3 weeks later, Soccer America noted that a coach had been hired, who immediately said, quote, "I'm a little vague on the details," end quote. And for much of what comes next, we'll be relying on Declan Abernathy's new dissertation, as well as Jerry Longman's Girls of Summer, Caitlin Murray's The National Team, and Rob Goldman's The Sisterhood, plus a great Grant Wall podcast on the 1991 team. Allow me one nitpick. One of these authors needed a soccer-savvy editor because no way the U.S. women's national team lined up in a 4-3-4 formation in the early 1990s.
Although to other teams, it may have sometimes felt that way. Anyway, in the summer of '85, around 70 young women around the country, mostly college players, but also people like a 17-year-old named Brandy Chastain, received letters from the U.S. Soccer Federation. Basically, congratulations, you have been chosen by U.S. Soccer to participate in the players' pool. Please come to Baton Rouge, Louisiana for the National Sports Festival in like 5 days. Now, the National Sports Festival used to be a big deal. It was an off-year competition for Olympic athletes in dozens of sports, from archery and volleyball to diving and figure skating. Women's soccer had never been included because it wasn't an Olympic sport, but pressure had been building to make it one.
Marty Mankemeyer was a chairwoman for the U.S. Youth Soccer Association, and she pushed the U.S. Soccer Federation to get women's soccer in the 1984 Olympics. That effort failed, but it got the attention of the Mundialito Cup, a little World Cup for women's national teams that was being held in Italy every summer.
Now, back in 1970, there had been an unofficial Women's World Cup in Italy, and then another the following year in Mexico. Denmark won both, and in 1971, they beat Mexico 3-0 in the final in front of 110,000 people at the Azteca. Those were big tremors for women's soccer around the world. Not enough to create a proper World Cup, but enough to get the Mundialito going in the 80s.
The Mundialito invited the U.S. to send a team to the 1985 tournament, and the National Sports Festival was going to be where the team was selected.
U.S. youth soccer had developed the ODP system, the Olympic Development Program, for boys in 1977 and then for girls in 1982. It gave players a discovery pathway at the state and regional levels, and that was what U.S. Soccer used to send its invites. The 70-odd players in Baton Rouge were split among 4 geographic regions: West, Midwest, South, and East teams. An Irishman named Mike Ryan coached the West.
Ryan was born in Dublin and moved to Seattle in his 20s. Following in the footsteps of older generations of Irish immigrants, he found industrial work as a metallurgist in a foundry. But he was also a soccer coach, building the men's program at the University of Washington and becoming the first president of the Washington Youth Soccer Association. The Seattle area was loaded with soccer talent, and Ryan's club team won 3 straight national championships. So his regional team was stacked with his players and made it to the final.
They were up against the team from the South, coached by Anson Dorrance, who was the coach of the University of North Carolina team.
And he would become the most dominant women's soccer coach in perhaps women's soccer history.
Before the game, Dorrance pulled 2 of his star players aside, Michelle Akers and Emily Pickering, a tough center back from Long Island whose high school didn't even have a girls' team until her senior year and who had just graduated from playing at UNC. Dorrance gave them a heads up that this year's national team wouldn't be on paper. Mike Ryan was picking a team that would be going to Italy. And he was a stickler for detail, like wearing your socks pulled up and your sleeves not tucked in.
A little context on the sock situation. It wasn't until 1985 that the USSF started requiring shin guards, but it wasn't about safety from getting kicked. It was about fears of contracting AIDS from an open cut.
Not that you were necessarily more likely to get a cut on your shin than, say, your hip or your thigh or your lip, but it was security theater, 80s style.
Like taking your belt off at TSA.
Now, the shirt sleeves tucked in thing came from shirts that were all cut for boys. So the sleeves would hang down to girls' elbows and look dorky and feel awkward. So if the sleeves were tucked into bra straps, it was more comfortable to play. And if your socks were also rolled down to your ankles, you'd get a lot more tan.
The West Regional won the match and the tournament. All the players gathered for the medal presentation. Then 17 members of what would be called the first official U.S. national team were called to the front by Mike Ryan and his assistant coach, Roger Rogers, an Englishman who'd settled in Alabama. It will not surprise you to hear that the first national team was white and suburban, or that a bunch were from the Pacific Northwest, players Ryan was already familiar with. He told them they'd be leaving for Italy in 2 weeks, so while U.S. Soccer worked on expediting their passports or getting temporary ones, they had to go home, pack, then get themselves to CW Post University on Long Island for 3 days of training before the flight to Milan.
3 days. They moved into a dorm and had scrimmages against local club teams. There was a cheerleading camp there at the same time, and Emily Pickering recalls that the cheerleaders got to practice on some really nice manicured field while the U.S. national team trained on basically a cow pasture, which aggravated a stress fracture that would keep her out of the opening game of the Mundialito. Meanwhile, Ryan was unimpressed with the level of intensity in training. As Akers once recalled, quote, "I wasn't the only player who didn't get this was the U.S. team and what an honor it is to play for your country. At one practice, he was just pissed at us. He was yelling at us, spit flying and frothing at the mouth. You guys aren't getting this. You're playing for your country, and this is an honor. You're representing every person in your nation. Now everyone, stand up and sing your national anthem." Right there on the field, he made us stand in a row and shout out the national anthem, unquote.
Not every 85er recalls the national anthem moment, but they agree that the idea of playing for their country against other countries wouldn't sink in until they were getting their asses kicked on the Adriatic coast, which we'll come to. After the first training camp in U.S. women's national team history, it was time to get on the plane and time to take a little break.
Okay, halftime. The women's national team pool in the late 80s and early 90s paved the way for the young stars of today. And one of those pioneers was Leslie Suter, who is also a friend of mine in Los Angeles. She has 2 daughters who love soccer, and one of them, Zoe, was a rising star in Southern California when, 3 years ago, at the age of 15, she was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. Now, Zoe's determination throughout her treatment has been inspiring, and the Suter family created a nonprofit called Zoe's Goal to raise awareness about pediatric cancer, advocate for research and funding, and help other kids who are facing challenges that no kid should have to deal with. What has also been inspiring is the support that Leslie's old friends and teammates have shown. So many players like Mia Hamm, Julie Foudy, and Tish Hawk, Michelle Akers, Saskia Weber, and Brandy Chastain, so many more, have given their time and their energy to rallying around the Suters. Those women helped grow the game beyond what they could have imagined. And now, women's soccer in the U.S. is a massive platform that can drive attention to issues that they care about, like the health of kids who grew up loving the game that their mom played. It's a privilege to be on the board of Zoe's Goal, and you can find more information about it at zoesgoal.org. There's a link in the episode notes. And now, back to the show.
We're on an Air Italia 747 headed to Milan with the first U.S. women's national team,
whose story reminds us quite a bit of some of the first U.S. men's teams.
Yeah, the last-minute passports were an echo of Jimmy Brown getting his citizenship finalized on the boat down to the first World Cup in 1930.
And Mike Ryan carried a bag of balls onto the plane, much like Thomas Bullets Cahill brought a bag of Spaldings on the boat to Sweden for his U.S. national team tour back in 1916.
Ah, the rhymes of U.S. soccer history.
The players had Adidas gear, matching white-collar shirts and blue tennis shorts. Some people even thought they were a tennis team. They also had brand new uniforms, which were surplus men's shirts that volunteers and some of the players' parents had spent the night before hemming and sewing patches onto the sleeves.
It's a bit of a myth. They're like iron-on, sewing, but it's a perfect, image that they had to, fix their uniforms. I mean, this was not a U.S. soccer marketing production. It was a classic example of the lack of funding and support that women got in the 80s and beyond. The players got $10 a day for food and a free pair of cleats. They flew overnight in coach. Some of them were sleeping on the floor of the plane, and they got to Italy the day before their first game. Of course, to save hotel and travel expenses.
U.S. Soccer couldn't even pay for those cheap plane tickets. The guy who'd officially invited the U.S. on behalf of the Italian Soccer Federation was a guy named Aldo Chirino, who was the Lamborghini rep in the U.S. He and the late Chuck Blazer worked with U.S. Soccer to move money around to cover expenses, and Alitalia ate some of the airfare.
Chuck Blazer didn't eat the airfare? If the name Chuck Blazer sounds familiar, we could do a whole episode about his role in the American game. He worked his way up from grassroots soccer to become the executive vice president of the U.S. Soccer Federation, general secretary of CONCACAF, and a member of the FIFA Exco. That's the executive committee.
He also ran up nearly $30 million on a corporate Amex, had 2 apartments in Trump Tower in New York, one for his cats, and a pet macaw that would sit on his shoulder while he cruised around New York on a mobility scooter. The bird was a gift from his ex-wife, who had taught it to screech, "You're a dope," at Blazer.
Don't give my wife any ideas. Anyway, in 2013...
You're a dope.
In 2013, he pled guilty to 10 counts of racketeering, money laundering, wire fraud, and tax evasion. His arrest led to the fall of FIFA and its longtime president, Sepp Blatter. We will have one more appearance in this story later. But in the 80s, Blazer was an ally of women's soccer. And without him, there would have been no team of the 85ers, who are now, finally in our story, getting off the plane in Milan.
After landing, the U.S. team took a 4-hour bus ride to Jesolo, a resort town near Venice, where they could finally check into their hotel and rest. No, not rest. Get changed for a parade. Mike Ryan remembered, "They had a big ceremony in the city center with a band and so on. We were absolutely exhausted. We got to bed around 11 o'clock, and we've been up for well over 30 hours. We're in no shape to play the next night," which we did.
I used to love when Don Imus would call out the lottery numbers. The Archbishop of New York, who was like Irish 30, 42,
That's right.
84.
All right. Their opening game was at Stadio Armando Picchi, which could hold about 4,000 people. The U.S. would be playing host Italy without Pickering and Akers, and as they were warming up, it felt like the crowd was against them. They heard what sounded like boos, and they'd heard them the night before during the parade as well. But then the U.S. players realized that the Italian fans were simply yelling what it said on their shirts. OOSA, USA.
This is a problem in the Adriatic. I was just on vacation in Slovenia, the home of your favorite first lady, and I ordered a beer, an India Pale Ale. The server comes up and kept referring to it as an IPA, not an IPA. So I get this whole OOSA thing now.
The teams stepped out for the national anthems, and the moment finally hit them. Defender Stacey Enos recalled, quote, "We hadn't done any trial runs. It's not like we practiced the anthem in Long Island. Like, here's the anthem and we want you to put your hand over your heart."
Unless Akers' memory about Mike Ryan was accurate and forced singing.
Yeah, this is a little bit of a strike against that. Enos continued, quote, "There was no precedent, and we just didn't know what to do. I've watched the men's U.S. team, but in Italy, we lined up wearing a patch that has the stars and stripes on, and the national anthem comes on, and I just remember smiling, thinking, I'm singing the national anthem. And I felt this deep sense of wonderment. I couldn't believe I was playing for my country in the first game ever for the United States women's national team," unquote.
Ooh, it gives me goosebumps. And the U.S. anthem ended. The Italian fans start chanting, "OOSA, OOSA, OOSA." Enos said it was overwhelming. The stadium was rocking with foreigners cheering for the USA.
Hard to imagine that now.
For sure. The team huddled up before kickoff. In a moment of spontaneity, Enos says, quote, "I just took the moment and said OOSA on 3, and it stuck."
It certainly did. It's even been trademarked by the U.S. WNT Players Association. But as much goodwill as there was from the Italian fans, particularly for Linda Gancitano, the Italian-American defender, the Italian team was less welcoming. And the U.S. team got a rough introduction to international soccer. According to Rob Goldman's The Sisterhood, quote, "They were pulling shirts, kicking shins, and spitting in the U.S. faces," unquote. As Akers put it later in the tournament, quote, "They understood soccer nuances and cultural social aspects of the game we just didn't get. Whenever a foul occurred back home, it usually meant a yellow or red card. They bashed us in the face, grabbed my crotch, and yanked at everything, including my shorts, even my underwear. They pulled as hard as they could, stomping our ankles and spitting at us when we were on the ground," unquote.
They got their first introduction to the dark arts. They were playing Italy, in Italy with Italian refs. Of course, they weren't going to get any calls. But for the U.S. team, this was an unprecedented trip. They had no idea what to expect. They were thrown off for the entire first half and were down 1-0. It didn't help that two of their toughest players, Akers and Pickering, could only watch.
Akers said, quote, "We were losing 1-0, and I'm watching my team getting the crap knocked out of us. We came back after the half, battered and bruised, and that was the first time I realized we were the USA playing against Italy, and I wanted us to win because it's our country," unquote. Her teammates felt the same way, and the U.S. came out hard in the second half. Gancitano was the first sub in U.S. national team history, and as she put it, quote, "I decided I was the player who wasn't going to take any more from anybody. I brought in a lot of energy and helped stop those unnecessary hits. I don't think the Italians liked getting put in their place, but I came back with it hard," unquote. The U.S. ended up drawing a penalty but missed the kick, and the game ended 1-0 to Italy.
Now, this is where you would expect the U.S. to go back to their hotel and do ice baths, massage, recovery training, optimize their physical preparation for 3 more games over the next 6 days. But again, this was a group getting their first experience overseas. It was more like spring break with soccer. When they weren't playing, they partied at local discos, took moped trips to Venice, and went to the beach.
Akers and some teammates rented a board to try windsurfing. They sailed a couple miles before realizing they couldn't turn around and ended up leaving the board behind on a beach and walking 2 miles back to the hotel. Meanwhile, Chuck Blazer, who'd come along with the team, was paying for food and drinks. Gancitano said, quote, "I don't know if he had crushes on some of the girls, but whenever we were downstairs getting stuff to eat or drink or whatever, Chuck told me to charge it to his room, so that's what we would do," unquote. She also said, quote, "If there was a curfew, I don't remember it," unquote.
So it's no surprise that by the time the U.S. lined up against Denmark for the second game, some of the players were tired and sunburned. Still, the U.S. managed to tie the Danes 2-2, with Michelle Akers scoring the first goal off an assist from Emily Pickering, and Pickering scoring the second off an assist from Akers.
After Denmark were more discos, beaches, and singing around the hotel piano before a 20-mile bus ride to Stadio Giovanni Chigiato, a 3,000-seat stadium in Caorle, also part of the city of Venice. For pronunciation help, we have to thank our good friend Peter Alleghi, who is Roman and rolls his R's and L's in a way that I can't. So I apologize. That is not the best way to pronounce Gaule. The U.S. was going to take on England in Gaule, and as Pickering said, quote, "We were bleary-eyed, completely exhausted, which made it difficult to perform," unquote.
And making it more difficult was the bus driver getting lost. After an hour of driving around, they pulled up to the stadium at kickoff. The referee asked Mike Ryan if he wanted some extra time for warm-ups, and for reasons known only to the late Ryan, he said no. England scored 3 times in the first 15 minutes, and the game was quickly out of hand.
Akers managed to pull a goal back, but then got her shoulder dislocated on a vicious hit. She would miss the last game, a rematch against Denmark, which finished 1-0 to the Danes. So the U.S. would end the tournament with 3 losses and a tie, and that record is honestly part of why the 85ers have been forgotten or swept under the rug by U.S. soccer. But the other countries at the Mundialito were more experienced than the U.S. Denmark had won the unofficial Women's World Cups in 1970 and 71, and Italy, Denmark, and England had all been invited to the first Mundialito in Japan in 1981.
Plus, they probably weren't jet lagged, and they probably picked their teams more than 2 weeks before. And we've pointed out this was an almost absurdly ill-prepared U.S. team, and they still managed to compete in every game. They certainly earned the respect of the Italian fans.
And more. On the flight home, a flight attendant on the Alitalia 747 walked back to coach and approached the team. "The pilot said there's a women's football players aboard and he wants to meet you," she said. Goalkeeper Kim Wyant and Linda Gancitano walked up the steps to the cockpit and sat with the captain, sharing milk and cookies and telling stories from the Mundialito. Wyant was the first U.S. women's national team keeper, along with Ruth Harker of St. Louis. Wyant would play 16 times for the national team, getting the first win and first shutout in program history, and since 2015, she's been head coach of the NYU men's team. She's currently the only female coach of an NCAA men's team and is also general manager and head coach of the Brooklyn City FC women's first team.
Respect from the Goalkeepers Union.
And from the Alitalia captain. As Wyant and Gancitano went back to their seats, he made an announcement that the U.S. women's national team was on board, and the other passengers applauded. Which was nice since no one was waiting for them when they landed. Much like the first men's national teams coming back from Scandinavia in 1916 or the first World Cup in 1930, no one back home had been following the tournament, and the players just went back to their lives.
Pickering and Enos went back to UNC and shared some of the Italian tactics with Anson Dorrance, who incorporated them into the Carolina tactics. "We called it push-pull," says Pickering. "We were grabbing jerseys, trying to balance ourselves and figure out how we could stay on our feet without punching the girl who's ripping our clothes off. When in doubt, I'm going to take you out," became our mantra. You can thank the Europeans for that.
Mike Ryan was immediately released as head coach and went back to his welding job and club coaching in Seattle. And we can question some of his performance. Players like Pickering certainly did. But his treatment from U.S. soccer also bums us out. The Federation gave him 3 days to train a team and flew them to Europe the day before the first game. And aside from that first half against England, which, again, Ryan bore some responsibility for, the U.S. was competitive in every game. And for that, he got no thanks, no recognition. He had to hound U.S. soccer for months to pay his expenses from the tournament. And in 1999, when the U.S. was playing its famous final in the Rose Bowl, he was home in Seattle watching it on TV, not invited to the game as part of the U.S. women's soccer story. After the tournament, he told Soccer America, quote, "Given the proper training, cooperation, and support, I'm convinced that the United States can play competitively in women's soccer with any country in the world." He also hoped the experience wouldn't be a one-shot thing, that there would be other tournaments to compete in.
There would be, but Mundialito 85 was Mike Ryan's one and only shot. Anson Dorrance was named the new head coach the following year, and he made some changes to the squad, like bringing in April Heinrichs,
who had been injured in 85,
and a new intensity that had defined North Carolina soccer and would soon define the U.S. women's national team. And a year later, there were two more seismic events in women's soccer. First, at the annual FIFA World Congress in Mexico City, held in conjunction with that summer's World Cup, 145 male delegates gathered, with one female one.
She was Norway's Ellen Villa, a 4'10" science teacher from Oslo. She later recalled, quote, "I actually changed the beginning of my speech right at the very last minute. FIFA had sent us its annual report a few hours earlier, and there was only half a page on women's football. Half a page! 99.9% of this report was for men only. So I had to start my speech with a scream of anger," unquote.
While there's no surviving transcript or recording of her speech, it has been recalled as this.
"I want a world championship for women. I want a women's soccer program in the Olympics, and I want common rules for all countries." Put on the spot by her surprise demand, FIFA President João Havelange punted to General Secretary Sepp Blatter, who stunned the room by saying, "I will accept the challenge, and you will see that we will go for the organization of a Women's World Cup."
A few months later, the U.S. women's national team returned to Jesolo for the Mundialito and beat China, Brazil, and Japan on its way to a final against Italy, which the U.S. would lose 1-0. But if you were looking at a soccer seismograph in 1986, the needle would be jumping.
The 1985 team didn't know how to play in an international tournament, but the talent was clearly there. The epigenetic history of women's soccer in the U.S., the boost provided by Title IX, and the courage of those 17 women who wore the OOSA shirt for the first time, they made the case that U.S. women's soccer could be what it has become. And for that, we think the 85ers should be remembered and celebrated.
And be in the National Soccer Hall of Fame. And that's our story.
Next week, we'll have a brief water break. The turf is very hot here at an American game. So we'll have a quick check-in and then be back in 2 weeks with a starting 11 of American soccer towns.
Now that's going to get chippy. Put on your shin guards and pull up your socks. And we'd like to dedicate today's show to our daughters, Maggie,
Esme,
and Isla. That's my daughter. I am producer Matt, aka the lad from Dundee.
An American Game is a team effort. Our supervising producer and editor is Matthew Nelson.
Our videos are produced by Larry Garrity.
Our theme music was composed by our old friend, former teammate, and Michael Bradley stunt double, Patrick White.
Special thanks to the scholars and reporters that we relied on for this episode, especially Dr. Declan Abernathy, Dr. Kelsey Ervick, Michael Lewis, Jerry Longman, Caitlin Murray, Rob Goldman, and Grant Wall.
R.I.P. Grant. And thanks to you for listening. That makes you part of the team. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, review, and tell your friends.
We'll see you soon.